Greetings, this is Eugene the Philosopher, the greatest living philosopher after the unfortunate passing of Quentin Robert de Nameland, who has been the greatest living philosopher before me. In this video, I wish to talk to you about the bad endings. We're gonna be discussing things like plots, theater, drama, things like that, alright? So, like the motivation for the essay on which this video is based was a point made by Sid Meier, the famous developer of Civilization, series of games among others. So the point he made at the GDC 2010, not sure what it was, conference, convention, whatever, game developer convention, I guess, or something. So the point he made there in his keynote presentation, which you can find on YouTube, was that fundamentally the ending of a game, of a movie, etc., should always be good, right? So Rambo should kill all the bad guys, Sherlock Holmes should solve all the mysteries and find the criminal, etc., etc. So there should be something like that in order for it to be satisfying, right? And it made me thinking about those things, about the good endings, bad endings, etc. So naively, you might say that, yeah, in order to be satisfied, you should have this, proverbial happy ending of Hollywood or something to that effect, which I've listed above pretty much. But we know for a fact that this is not the case. Like, there's a whole bunch of beautiful pieces which end pretty badly, right? And in fact, if you think about it, the tragedy where things go really bad sometimes it actually precedes comedy, at least in historical terms, right? In Greek theater, everything began from tragedy, and only later it was transformed into comedy. So what the hell is wrong with that thing, right? So let's try to examine it and figure it out, hopefully. So I would say that in a wider sense, not in this naive sense, we might say that actually any ending would be good if it's going to be logical, if it's going to be deserved in some sense, right? If it's going to be natural. So we might actually say that the dynamic of a plot of any sort of piece has a lot of similarities to what mechanics is studying, like literal branch of physics, the literally mechanics. I would say there's a lot of similarities in how objects in mechanics behave, how they interact with each other, and they always tend to move, as we know, according to Hamilton's principle, according to stationary action, So there's always some preferential trajectory, a phase trajectory of how things turn out, let's say. And I think in drama you should also have this preferential trajectory, this most natural way of unraveling of stuff, right? Of happening, essentially. Which would correspond to the most plausible flow of events when in mechanics you have physical bodies interacting and moving, but in drama you have ensembles of power essentially interacting and moving, and from the interaction of those ensembles of power, wills to power, if you like, in Nietzschean terms, you have conflict, right? And you cannot have any drama without conflict. So again, the very necessity of having a conflict in your drama indicates that, yeah, this is exactly what's going on. We need to have some interaction, some clash of interests, right? Some politics, in the definition I gave in some of the previous videos, such as pseudoscience and scientific pyramids, for example. All right, so a dramatic piece should have this, what Nietzsche calls logic of passion, this shortest line, this harsh necessity. It's Nietzsche's words about Prosper Mérimée novel Carmen, on which the famous opera is based. And in general, I would say, kind of reinforcing the point I made above, that the playwrights are sort of like engineers, right? They again, using this analogy with mechanics, they engineer the conflict, right? They set the boundary conditions, the initial conditions, in such a way that a natural flow of things would lead to something spectacular and cool, right? So this is what playwrights essentially do. And there's a famous saying in Russian-speaking world of Yuri Alesha, who said that writers are actually engineers of human souls. But this phrase was actually popularized by Stalin, and I think Stalin meant completely other thing, not the thing that I mean by using this quote, where Stalin actually meant that writers should, you know, shape the new type of human, right? The Soviet citizen or whatever. Like writing should be used as a tool of propaganda, but that's not what I mean when I quote this phrase. I actually mean that writers, they actually engineer the conflict in their writings, right? Because otherwise it would be dull and uninteresting without that. Okay, so we have this logic of the situation that allows the state of things to evolve in this, you know, geodesic line, so to speak, the shortest path, the most logical path, this necessary path, yeah. I would say that this invisible logic, it's like an invisible motor that is built into any sort of dramatic piece. And I think you can say that previously, in ancient times, let's say, this invisible motor was actually sometimes confused, or rather associated with divine interventions. And you can think of, for example, the story of Oedipus Rex by Sophocles, a very famous story, where you have Oracle, right, which plays the role of this divine intervention. So Oracle tells us that, okay, we have this point right here where you're asking me, but you also have this final point, which is my prophecy is about, right? But we're still missing this trajectory in between them, okay? And by the way, the whole point of prophecies as dramatic instrument is very interesting. It brings this whole nonlinear thing, you know, like you're in the present, you're seeing something from the future, right? So you already know where you'll end up with, etc., etc. So it's very interesting, and the whole thing of self-fulfilling prophecies, etc. Star Wars, by the way, also have that, right? Where Anakin receives this prophecy, etc., etc. It's a very interesting topic to think about, at least. So, yeah, we have this initial point and final point, and dramatically speaking, it actually creates this background, like a very contrast background, where we can trace the trajectory. So we already know where we're starting and where we're ending in, so our attention might be 100% focused on the path in between, right? So this is a really good, I think, perhaps it was invention of Sophocles, I'm not sure, but it's a really great dramatic instrument, I would say. And by the way, it also shows that spoilers actually do not reduce your pleasure from, let's say, observing a theatrical piece. And it's actually has been proven by scientific research that, yeah, if you know how the movie would end or what would happen, it doesn't reduce your pleasure from watching it. So I completely don't understand this whole paranoia about spoilers. You know, take a movie like Titanic, like, spoiler alert, you know, the ship is gonna sink. So what? It's still like everybody knew that it's gonna sink, and yet it's the most successful movie in all history. Like, I mean, if you take inflation into account. I mean, obviously there are those considerations with gender, which I've elucidated in my video about gender. I mean, with regards to Titanic, but so this is probably the major factor that made it so famous. But anyway, so everybody knows what the movie is about. Pretty much the plot is already known, yet people still like it, right? So yeah, I think it's a great illustration. Or again, Star Wars, take the prequels, where you already know what's gonna happen in 4th episode, yet you still go there and watch the first 3. I mean, there was a lot of dissatisfaction, let's say, with the prequels, but I like them. I think they're good movies. Okay. There's some other thing. Oh yeah, actually the Greek plays themselves, some of them are based on mythology, which again, people already knew. Like, so there was no novelty in the sense of the basic, you know, kind of like the pillar points of the plot, so to speak. But it was the mastery of the playwright to make them all look natural, you know, to connect the dots, so to speak. Again, we have this initial point and the final point, but we don't care about it. What we care about is exactly this internal mechanics of what's going on, this internal, intrinsic logic of the situation that brings us from point A to point B. This is what really matters. So, and this is also why spoilers are not a threat to your enjoyment of any sort of movie or theatrical piece or whatever. Okay, so don't be afraid of spoilers. This is the takeaway from this segment. So prophecy created this contrast background, kind of like, I mean in Oedipus' story, kind of like this Schlieren method, you know, of visualizing the flows of air or something like that. It creates that sort of lighting, which is really interesting, and I really like that. So we can completely focus on the internal mechanics of conflict, of drama, etc. And you can probably say that one of the points, I guess, of the whole story of Oedipus is kind of calming, comforting. It's like a healing balm, you know, even though it's horrible. But the point is that it introduces this fatalism, you know. Whatever you do, you'll end up in that point B, even though the most interesting part happens in between, but you'll still end up there, right? So since Oedipus was actually the wisest of men, it brings comfort to our lives to know that even the wisest men also suffer from their fate. And fundamentally, one of the points of Sophocles is actually that even gods themselves also suffer from fate. And this is certainly comforting because, you know, we're not alone in this. Everyone has to deal with it. And in some sense, it's religious, you know, in the initial meaning of this word. So it tends to unite because everyone, again, suffers from that. There's a stupid fly crawling on the camera right now. I hope it wouldn't disrupt the image. It's kind of funny. All right. So, and another point, I guess, with regards to this whole discussion is that if we actually, if we were only able to uncover this hidden mechanics of what's going on, we can actually also be like an oracle, like a god, essentially, because we could see this point B, because we would already know how the stuff behaves in between, so we can project into the future and see the future fundamentally. So, and it's optimistic, this whole idea that we can be godlike, we can know the future if we only figure out the mechanics, right? I mean mechanics in the most general sense. The politics, science, philosophy, things like that. Okay, so we know that this end should lie somewhere in that natural trajectory, this geodesic line. But where should it be, right? A question still remains. And I think here you should have there's a lot of considerations to take into account. Like, you can have mathematical considerations. You can say that the parts of your piece should be in some harmonic, whatever, ratio. Like, for example, the Soviet director Sergei Eisenstein, I guess you could call him in a more English accent. He actually used golden ratio in his movies. Like, he subdivided segments in such a way so that they would create golden ratio. But it kind of feels somewhat far-fetched to me. But definitely you should also take into account the physiological constraints, right? Nobody's gonna sit in a movie theater and watch a movie that lasts like 7 hours. It's just physiologically very hard to do, etc. So you have to take all that into account. And by the way, for example, Greek plays, they were actually very different in the way that these festivals where the plays were set at, they actually lasted sometimes a whole day or a whole week even. And so a lot of the audience was kind of ebbing and flowing, you know. A person might have come to the middle of some piece and or something, so that was pretty normal. So again, you have to take all that into account, you know, the culture of consumption, if you like, of this cultural product that you're trying to put out. Okay, so you definitely also have constraints in terms of where the ending should be from the content itself, right? If your plot is about someone, then when they die, well, probably it's a good place to end your movie, right? Or if they die, like if it's already understood that they're gonna die soon and inevitable, right? So you can already put an end there and kind of miss that last part where the actual death occurs. It would still be logical and kind of understandable, etc., etc. So there's a lot of considerations, let's put it that way. But here I also want to note about, I've already mentioned that tragedy actually produced comedy. And there's a great book by Nietzsche about it, The Birth of Tragedy from the Spirit of Music. I'm not sure what's the correct translation to English, but probably something like that. It's exactly about that, about the Greek tragedy. It's a very cool book. So I wish to note that in particular, this is one of the ideas that Nietzsche promotes in this book, is that Euripides was actually the killer of the Greek tragedy, and he actually initiated the new Attic comedy. So the comedy appeared pretty much in the plays of Euripides. So I was talking about this mechanics before, and curiously enough, in the pieces of Euripides, this is my point already, not Nietzsche's, there's a explicit externalization, I guess, of this mechanics, and at the same time vulgarization and personalization of this hidden mechanics I was talking about. And of course, I mean Deus Ex Machina, this famous tool that he introduced, some weird machine that was supposed to be the voice of God, right? Which told us how things should end up or something to that effect. So yeah, and it's very interesting that how basically what was assumed and implied and was kind of this subterranean flow previously, Euripides actually introduced it in explicitly, but in this caricaturized form, pretty much in this Deus Ex Machina form. I hope it's my idea is more or less clear from what I've said. But in general, returning to the overall topic of the endings and stories themselves, I should say that even horrible stories, actually any stories, even horrible ones, are calming and comforting. Well, firstly, because most of the stories are being told from the future, right? So somebody tells us what he has seen or she, or what happened before, etc., which means that since we right now in the future are still alive and healthy, etc., then probably it's not that bad what happened previously. Even if it's really bad, it's not that bad, you know? And the second possibility is that we're living in real world, but many of the stories people tell are fictional. So we shouldn't be afraid of them anyways, okay? So we're kind of observing them from this safety behind the bulletproof glass, so to speak. And here I should, again, returning to the point that any story is good, I guess. It's enjoyable, even the horrible story, just because it's a story, right? I wish to give you a quote from Friedrich Schiller, that from German romantic poet, is that it's better to face a horrible end than to suffer from horror with no end, unending horror, basically. And I wish to give you a quotation from myself, from my own aphorism, again, a bit more than 10 years old, is that any story that has an end is already one half happy, just because it has an end. So this is indeed my point that I wish to discuss in this next segment, is that the very existence of the end in any story makes it enjoyable, right? And even horrible story, when it ends, the end kind of teleports you to safety again, right? You're not seeing or reading or whatever all these horrors anymore, and you're, in a way, it actually allows you to enjoy your own being right here, right now, just because, by showing you some much more horrible being, you know? There's this famous saying that we don't actually value stuff we have until we lose it, right? But here you see that there's a horrible being, horrible way of life or something, and you suddenly realize, well, wait a minute, everything is pretty cool with me, right? I should be glad that I'm alive, that I can breathe, that I can walk, etc., that I feel good. So there's that part of this enjoyment. But there's also another part, again, regarding horrible, disgusting, violent stories, etc. And here I wish to quote Nietzsche again, not directly quote, but Nietzsche says that the very existence of author that created this piece, this movie or this book or whatever, or this painting, the very existence of author actually reinforces us, because we know that, okay, there was some other guy who actually wrote all that. So he had all of that in his imagination or whatever, and he survived, he endured through that. And we kind of feel that support from his side, because, well, we're also a human being like this author, so if the author didn't die, well, we'll probably survive also, right? And his, powerful figure of the author, it kind of reinforces us, because he survived through that. And compare that to life itself. In life, the situation is completely different, right? Life has no author. I mean, you can be probably the author of your own life, but it's very hard, as you might imagine. And there's no one to lead you through life. There's no author. There's no this external agency that kind of already mapped everything for you, right? Life is chaotic, fundamentally. There's no one to lead you through all the mazes of horrors and tragedies in your own life. But it doesn't end there, because actually there's not much logic in life, firstly, and secondly, it doesn't have an end. Exactly what I've talked about previously. Like a piece of art, it always has an end, whereas life, fundamentally, I would say it has no end. Like, life might be there when you're alive, or it might not be there when you're dead. But like, the moment of death, it doesn't exist for you. It certainly exists for others, because, well, they observe you're alive, then bam, you're not alive anymore, right? So they can register your death, but you cannot register your own death, because when you die, you just disappear. So there's no one to register your death from your point of view. That's what I'm saying. So you're either in life, or you just don't exist. And this is horrible. Exactly because there's nowhere to go outside to have a break, from life. No, you're just immersed in it completely, and you cannot exit it. And this is absolutely horrible, I think. A horrible thing about life. Well, arguably you could say that maybe drugs, like alcohol or heavier drugs, they might be actually the tool that people try to use to have a break from life, like to just get wasted and just, kind of have a pit stop, so to speak, kind of wait somewhere for the things to turn out on their own. So just get the hell away from me. I'm trying to have a break, fundamentally. Yeah. So like using drugs, I would say it's this escapism, the desire to have a break from life. Okay. At least one of the motivations for doing drugs, right? So yeah, I think, and that's why, by the way, art is so pleasing for us, is so appealing, because art has all that we lack in life. It has logic, it has harmony, and it has an end. The most important part, it has this frame outside of which it doesn't exist. So we can freely enter it, and we can disengage from it to whenever we want, basically, right? So these are all the traits that we don't have in life. Like, yeah, you can commit suicide probably, but it's very painful, it's very scary, etc., etc. So, but with art, it's all joyful, fundamentally, right? So it's very different. Yeah, and okay, so let's probably return to that initial naive idea of a bad ending, a bad ending where, to at least justify the title of this video, right? A bad ending where, let's say, a villain wins, like he kills a lot of people or whatever, he does some nasty stuff, or it might be, depersonalized, like a meteor falls and kills everyone, something like that, right? Like a proverbial bad ending, let's say. So why do we like bad endings? Because sometimes we do, right? Again, in tragedies. So I would say that there are fundamentally two ways that we can enjoy bad endings. Or not the ways that we can enjoy, rather two reasons why we might enjoy. Or two types of people, let's say, who can enjoy bad endings. But anyway, and with very different motivations. So I would say that the first type of people, the first kind of way of enjoyment of bad endings would be envy, essentially, and jealousy, maybe. So unhappy people, they obviously they gloat at suffering of happy people, So if you feel very unhappy, if you feel that other people treat you badly, obviously you would gloat if they would suffer. You would say, aha, eat that, bastard. You should have been better to me, right? You should have treated me better, etc. So it's this revenge, fundamentally. It's this ressentiment approach, this lumpenproletariat, type of approach to life, like let us have our revenge on bourgeoisie, where in this case it's like emotional bourgeoisie, people who actually enjoy life, not like you, people who have this happy emotional stance which you lack. So you gloat at their suffering, obviously, because you bastards get that, right? So this is and this is probably, I should say, it's more or less a subconscious reaction. So even more or less happy people can have that, because no one's absolutely happy, right? So everyone has some degree of unhappiness. So everyone, to some degree, might enjoy the failures of others. Again, everyone can laugh at these stupid jokes when somebody falls, literally, right? And etc. So, the second type, that was the first type. It's this jealousy, envy fueled lumpen proletariat approach. Like, let us have our revenge at more happy people. Let them suffer. So this might be a motivation for enjoyment of bad ending, right? Where a lot of people suffer somehow, or at least some specific people suffer, whatever. But the second type of enjoyment of bad endings would be, I would say, masochistic one. And it's more complicated, I would say, than this simple envy or jealousy that we had in the first type. A person, so the masochistic type of enjoyment is fundamentally a person enjoying the feeling of destruction or damage, and in particular destruction or damage to himself or herself, right? Or in terms of art, like he might damage himself by observing a person that he likes dying, for example. Like, I really like this character, so if the character dies, I might feel masochistic enjoyment because I liked the character, and when the character died, I felt suffering, right? Which was transformed into masochistic satisfaction, essentially. See what I'm saying? But by damaging myself, by losing this character, I felt better. I felt joy, fundamentally, right? So a destruction of, let's say, a beautiful city, or a wise man, again, something like a very positive character, etc. All those things might fuel masochistic enjoyment, fundamentally, and it all might be related to the whole bad ending issue, right? You might have a masochistic pleasure from observing a bad ending. Yeah, and I would say, obviously, again, returning to tragic art, there's a lot of connections to that, and to Oedipus' story, obviously. Like, the whole point of masochistic pleasure, and I would say any other pleasure, actually, is the feeling of power. When you feel that you're strong, this is fundamentally the source of all the pleasure, right? But you might say, well, it doesn't sound logical. Like, how do you feel stronger from damage? Like, it's absolutely the reverse process, right? Damage means feeling of loss, like you've lost some power, right? But I think it's logical, on the other hand, like if you see the bigger picture, because well, for example, again, let me give you this famous mantra of Nietzsche that what doesn't kill you makes you tougher, right? It's usually used in this, again, calming, comforting mood, like, oh, it doesn't matter, everything's okay, it doesn't kill you, would make you tougher, etc. But I think people miss this colossal positive meaning that it has. Because what it means, I think, is that, like, what doesn't kill me makes me tougher, is that, again, it's this masochistic point, the masochistic tendency of receiving pleasure from receiving damage, essentially. Like, a masochist might tell you, like, harm me whatever you want, right? Try to kill me, like, put all your effort in it. But I'm so powerful that all of that would be only like tickling to me. Like, I can take any amount of damage and my injuries would only reveal my strength. That's what a masochist feels, I think. Like, yeah, this is the main idea. Like, any injury you inflict on a masochist would only help him reassure himself that he was so strong that he survived this injury, and that would kind of, his pleasure would skyrocket from that, right? And obviously it has a lot of connections to sexuality. I mean, there's the whole domination BDSM thing, but there are also many sublimated forms of that masochistic thing. Again, you might say marriage is a kind of a, like the whole courtship of women. For a man, it's a masochistic ritual. Like, he submits himself to a woman. Like, he basically kind of tries to satisfy her, etc., etc. So it's fundamentally masochistic, and obviously it's also sexual at the same time. But there's also a lot of other things which might be considered masochistic, I would say. Like, for example, the whole, like, bittersweet mood, you know, this feeling of sadness from which you feel actually good, you feel joy, or like the destruction of beauty, any sort of acts like that. They might bring you this masochistic pleasure. Maybe tattoos are masochistic in nature, I'm not sure. Like you're obviously damaging your body, right? You're putting some stains on it, essentially. And I think it might be motivated by masochistic tendencies. And so, and there's a lot of other examples in culture. Like, for example, what Confucius says is that big tits with no ass might fill your hands, but big ass with no tits would fill your heart. Wait a minute, that's a wrong quote. No, he actually said that big mountain should be destroyed, and the strong stream should break, and a wise man should fade away like a plant. That's what he said. But anyway, it's also this masochistic mood, as you can see. And by the way, a famous movie, Fight Club, it's interesting because it combines both of those types of enjoyment that I've mentioned, both the lumpenproletariat revenge against bourgeoisie and all the, you know, rich and happy people, and also the masochistic self-destructive enjoyment, right? So maybe because of that, this movie is so famous, so popular. Okay, but I would say that in general, whole civilizations and cultures might demonstrate the very same features, may be affected by these tendencies. Like, for example, the cultures might intentionally poison themselves, kind of, for example, normalizing destructive behavior, like, well, for example, feminism, right? It obviously leads to a drop in birth rates. It obviously leads to drop of the economy, etc. So it's absolutely self-destructive behavior. But maybe we're actually having some masochistic pleasure culture-wise from that, right? We're feeling that we're so strong that we can tolerate any kind of stupid BS like that, and we can survive through that anyways, right? And in some sense, this is actually true. Like the capitalism in 19th century, it has accumulated such a wealth that now we can be stupid and do all those things that we're doing today, right? And I would say that there's a strong analogy that you can derive with all those, self-poisoning practices of different cultures and seasoning, in cooking. Like, what is a seasoning? It's a little bit of the poison that you cannot eat, yet you still add it into your food. You can't eat salt. It's really a poison, right? It tastes really bad. It dehydrates you immediately, etc., etc. I'm not sure what the deadly dose is, but it's pretty small. It's like a, I don't know how much, maybe 10 grams or something. Don't quote me on that. Or you cannot eat pepper, right, etc., etc. So it's fundamentally a poison, yet you add it to your food, which you can actually eat a little bit of it, right, and it makes it more colorful, more enjoyable. And I would say that it's, again, in some vague sense, it's also a masochistic thing, because what seasoning adds to your food, it adds this resistance, it's this part that you cannot tolerate in some sense. So it kind of resists you. And yet, by overcoming this resistance, you feel joy. And this is, and overall, the overall net effect of that is that you're enjoying your food more. Because the food without seasoning is so dull, it's not resisting you enough, You need to add something bad to it, a little bit of poison that would kind of counteract your pressure in abstract terms, obviously. And you would feel enjoyment through overcoming this pressure. So, okay, it was kind of abstract, but I hope you get the idea. So basically the point I'm making is that, a little speck of poison makes you realize your strength. And this is exactly this sort of masochistic enjoyment where you have a resistance, but you overcome it, right? You have an injury, but you still survive and you're still strong, etc., etc. Okay, and there's a lot of other examples of that. Like we can see that in music, for example, where people might end their piece, their song or whatever, with let's say a dominant chord or subdominant, which is absolutely unheard of in like classical harmony. Well, because it's kind of dissonant, right? You need the tonic chord, and yet a lot of songs end in, modern pop songs or rock songs, they end in dissonant chords, which is again this sort of seasoning. People hear the tonic, they can even sing it, but they're kind of satisfied that it's not there. It's this resistance, this I won't give you what you want. It's this play, this teasing, which again makes the stuff more interesting, because just to give you a tonic, it would be super dull. You would say, we've heard that like 200 times already. It's dull. It actually makes me remember Johann Sebastian Bach, the German composer. There's this story how his sons were actually annoying him deliberately by playing on this clavichords, or how do you call it in English, like the proto piano, let's say, some sequence of chords and ending on a dominant, like on a dominant chord. Not playing the tonic, in the end. And Bach was so annoyed by that, like he was chasing them, etc., etc. And he actually had to run to the instrument and play the tonic chord himself, because it was so terrible to him not to hear the tonic chord in the end. But today we can actually tolerate much more than that. We have, this whole culture of diatonic or atonic music. We have all those whole tone scales, and all that even was utilized already even in rock music, like for example in bands like King Crimson, and some other progressive rock bands have utilized a lot of that. So it's our conscious venture, I would say, into all those realms. Like we're looking at how much damage we might tolerate, like how much resistance we can resist, let's say. All right. And we're feeling stronger just doing that. Like we need to hear, like the whole idea of atonic music is that you don't have a tonic, right? You're using all the 12 tones of this well-tempered system, equal temperament, right? By the way, introduced by Bach, or at least popularized by Bach. So we're deliberately going, like we like to hear the tonic, but we're saying no, we're gonna get rid of the tonic and feel this masochistic pleasure because of that, right? You see the idea? Like, we need the tonic, but we're deliberately getting rid of it, so that we can feel stronger, that we actually can survive without it. All right, this is again the masochistic pleasure. All right, and probably near the end here, I would talk a little bit about this modern, not only modern, but this aesthetic of horrible, of disgusting stuff, of disfigured faces, of death and decomposition. Some people like that type of images, like people from this goth subculture or Lovecraft fans. I am a Lovecraft fan, somewhat at least. Maybe I'll make a video about him sometime in the future. But anyway, so there's this, I'm not saying I'm a fan of this aesthetic of horrible, but like I like Lovecraft for other reasons. But there are people who are almost like obsessed with it, with all those horrible images. Again, they might make tattoos of something horrible, like etc., etc. So I think I'm not entirely sure why that is the case, but I think it's actually the consequence of shame, or maybe shyness. Is a better word. Like, these people are only enjoying these pictures because these pictures help them to shoo other people away. That's the point, you see. This is, I think, by the way, one of the points Lovecraft was into, really. He wanted kind of to be alone in some sense, So he kind of shooed other people away with these horrible writings, or at least I think that was one of his main ideas. So these people are shy, and because of that, they turn to this horrible imagery, and fundamentally some tragic, I don't know, meat grinding things, Okay. Yeah, I'll probably need to wrap up somewhere here. I think I'll just mention that this kind of returning to where we started, that Oedipus' path is fundamentally a path of knowledge. It's a path of philosophy and science, of this, again, revelation of the underlying mechanics, like the oracle told him where the point A is, where they were when the oracle was asked, and where the point B was, that he, kills his father, marries his mother, etc. But the path of Oedipus is in the middle, the mechanics that happens in the middle. And any scientist or philosopher, or whatever, any explorer of the world should endure through all that, you know. And it's very tragic, like knowledge is very tragic. So sometimes you have to suffer for that. You have to earn your knowledge, you know, through suffering. So this is the path you're walking at your own expense, fundamentally. Okay, that's enough, I think, for today. I should say that in the next month or about so, like roughly until August, the first week of August, there will be no more videos on this channel because I'm having a vacation. But in August, I'll be here again, and I'll definitely make a lot of new videos. Like, maybe not a lot, but right now even I can think of at least 6 or 7 of them. So there's definitely gonna be more videos here, just a little bit later. Okay, so since I've started with Sid Meier's idea, I think I should end with Sid Meier's idea, although that's not exactly him, but it was a character from Sid Meier's Alpha Centauri game, a really great game with a lot of philosophy behind it. So this character is Chairman Shenji Yang, kind of like a Chinese, socialistic, post-humanistic type of guy. A pretty creepy guy, actually, but also very interesting, definitely. So I think this quote is kind of relevant to what I was talking about here. It's so the quote, I'll try to quote it from my memory, but I'm not exactly sure I would be able to, but I'll try. So he said that if our society seems more nihilistic than that of previous eras, perhaps it is simply a sign of our maturity as a sentient species. As our collective consciousness expands outwards beyond some crucial point, we are at last ready to face life's fundamental truth, that the only purpose of life is life itself. Okay, so thank you for watching. The eons are closing.